Welcome to the 12th Inherit the Earth Sand and Shadows Developers Report. I'm Joe Pierce. This video has the following topics: a game development update, I touch on a webcomic milestone, a Califur Con report, an interview with Robert McNally, and a second con report about E3, the Electronic Entertainment Expo. So let's get started. As you wish, Riff talking in my voice. All of Riff's front-facing standard animations are complete, including mouth positions for lip syncing. The final back-facing frame should be arriving from Ryan shortly. Ed has nearly completed the Known Lands Overland map. I will be requesting a few tweaks to make the mountains to the north appear more impassable. The Inherit the Earth webcomic reached a major milestone in early June, strip number 500. We took a break from the current story, Catch and Release, to instead create an illustration showing every significant character that has appeared in the original game or the comic, plus a few other random morphs, so every known tribe was represented. Can you name them all? On Friday, June 3rd, I attended Califur. The con changed venue this year and took place at the Sheraton Hotel and Convention Center in Pomona, California. The theme for this year's con was high fantasy and Renaissance fairs. The Convention Center is actually part of the Pomona Fairplex, which is the site of the LA County Fair that takes place later in the summer. At the opening ceremonies, Vincent Mink welcomed everyone to the con. He asked how many people in the audience were new to Califur, and a large percentage raised their hands. Maybe moving the con to Pomona was a good idea. The con had two guests of honor, both artists. Sitting in the chair is Christina M. Yen, aka Six-Leaf Clover. The other guest of honor, Terry Denman, an artist at Blizzard Entertainment, could not attend on Friday. To go with the high fantasy theme, there was the concept of a quest for the dragon sword. I'm sure it's nothing like a quest for an orb. The large event space allowed for a more spread out dealer's room, with a lot of room for expansion, which is good because I hope to have a table here next year. Six-Leaf Clover had a table. Here are pictures of a couple tables in the room. Kids blowing things up. One interesting panel I attended was presented by the aforementioned Vincent Mink. The topic was Disney's Adventures of Robin Hood, and how, for some older anthropomorphic animal fans, this movie acted as a gateway to being a furry. Did you know that Robin Hood was Disney's first ever film featuring only anthropomorphic animal characters? I wonder what their second such film was. And not surprisingly, Zootopia is having an impact similar to Robin Hood. Who knows, maybe all the first-time attendees to this year's Califur were because of Zootopia and not the venue change. I could only be at the con Friday, so I missed chronicling the fursuit parade that is held on Saturday. That doesn't mean there wasn't some cosplay going on. Donuts. And now on to the interview. Today I'm here with Robert McNally. Say hi, Robert.
Hi, Joe.
I know you started in the video game industry while quite young. How were you initially introduced to the industry?
Well, when I was 11 years old, I started hanging around one of the first computer stores in the LA area. It was called Rainbow Computing. It was in Granada Hills where I lived with my parents. And the Apple II had just come out then. And I just started making a nuisance of myself around the store, and they tolerated me, and they started teaching me things, and I started learning things by reading the books, and I was always fascinated with games. There weren't many games to play, so once you played the games that were available for the computer at that point, the Apple II, what was there to do? Well, you learned how to program in BASIC, and that's what I started doing, and I wanted to write games, but there was no games industry. There was barely a software industry at that point.
So what was the first company you worked for, and what titles did you do for them?
The first company I actually got hired full-time to work for was one of the very first consumer educational software firms. It was called EduWare Services, and I was hired to work on the Atari 400-800 originally. I did the Atari 400 and 800 versions of their fractions and decimals learning program. I also worked on an incomplete port of David Mullock's game based on The Prisoner, which was already out for the Apple II at that time, and they were starting to port it to the Atari. And that was a lot of fun. And I also created a lot of their core tools that they created a lot of their other educational software with at that time. That was my first time programming job, and I think it was 14 years old at that point.
That is starting early.
Yeah, well, I mean, I left high school 2 years early because I was already getting job offers, and so I took the equivalency exam and started working, and that was much more interesting to me than school. I've always been very much a self-learner.
If I remember correctly, you also worked on porting a Star Trek game?
Yeah, so a lot of my early work in games was porting games to the Apple II from other platforms. I worked on a game I was actually, at 17, I was hired by Sega and moved down to San Diego, lived there for about a year. I was their youngest programmer. I was actually renting my own apartment in an apartment building, but I was too young to even use the gym in the apartment because their insurance wouldn't allow it, so I got a gym membership elsewhere. But yeah, so I worked as an employee on the Apple II, and they had a coin-operated game called Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator designed by Sam Palinuk, and I created the Apple II port of that game. I also worked on other Apple II ports of things like Activision's Ghostbusters, and I'm sure there are others I'm missing right now. But yeah, but I've always been an Apple fanboy, and it was interesting because some of the other machines at that time, like the Commodore 64 and the Atari 400, 800, actually had, in some ways, better graphics and sound hardware than the Apple II. But I was an expert on the Apple II, and I could make it do things that a lot of people, that were pretty challenging to do on the Apple II to kind of get a lot of the same effects on these other machines, but on the Apple II.
Eventually, you started working on original titles. Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, well, I always wanted to work on original titles, and I, got an opportunity to do that. Actually, this was around the time I met you. We were both working for a company called Micro Illusions, which was in was it Northridge or Granada Hills? I can't remember.
Granada Hills.
Granada Hills, right? This was in the age of the Amiga, and so the 68,000 processor in the Amiga and the early Mac, they shared that. And I had learned 68,000 assembly language, and C was starting to become a thing. And so, yeah, I basically worked on 3 original titles. Actually, one of them was published by a company called Miles Computing. That was called Quintet. That was a board game, a strategy game based on Parker Brothers' Pente board game, which is kind of a Connect 5 on a Go board kind of game. Then the 2 I did for Micro Illusions was Evanstar, which was a 4-player action game around a black hole with you trying to shoot your opponents into a black hole. So 4 people could gather around and play simultaneously on the same Amiga keyboard. And I still get fan mail about that from time to time. I'm still very happy with how that game came out. And then I got the opportunity to work on a game based on the Jetsons animated series for Micro Illusions. And all 3 of these titles I just mentioned, Quintet and Evanstar and the Jetsons, I co-designed and co-authored with my brother Michael McNally, who we both got into computers fairly young. He went to UCLA and then worked from startups, and he finally landed at Google, where he's been ever since, and he's done quite well there. But yeah, some of the early titles we worked on together were basically working together as brothers and co-developers of those games.
What was your impetus for forming the Dreamers Guild, the developer of Inherit the Earth, Quest for the Orb?
Well, I think it was around the time I was working with Micro Illusions, and I had made your acquaintance and the acquaintance of David Joyner, who's known more widely these days as Talon, and you both became my friends. And another company I'd done some contracting work for was called Cinemaware. I think they were located out in Ventura or something like that, and they laid off a bunch of people, some very talented people that I had met while doing contracting for them. And I remember inviting a bunch of people I knew, including you guys and some Cinemaware people, to lunch. It might have been at the Good Earth restaurant in Northridge or something like that. And I said, basically, hey, if we ever wanted to start a company, a lot of us are available right now. Why don't we consider it? And there were enough interested people that we did. And I think you reminded me, it was like 11 people that started the Dreamers Guild. And our intent was to create a company where, yeah, we work on other people's contracts and ports and stuff like that, but the intention was always to begin to self-fund our own original titles, which we eventually did, including Inherit the Earth.
You were the president of the company. What does the president of a gaming company do?
Well, there wasn't many patterns to follow back then, although there were a few, it was still fairly early on in the consumer software industry. But basically, my job was to make sure the operations of the company got done. We had a very participatory structure. Even engineers and artists and so on got to participate in some of the management aspects of the company, and to kind of set the vision and set the bar for the kind of the quality and standards that the company would produce. And even though I was not as, or I was, maybe as experienced as some of the other people I was working with, and some people were somewhat more experienced than me. I've always been a natural leader, and I was able to kind of rally people around the vision, and that's a big part of what I did from day to day. And signed contracts and worked on getting us new contracts and things like that. So there was a lot of fairly kind of trivial administrative stuff, but the exciting stuff to me was kind of carrying the vision of the company.
What was your involvement in the genesis of Inherit the Earth?
So when I first met you and Talon, you guys were roommates with another couple, Greg and Monty Hemsath, at a house. They affectionately referred to it as the Hugger House, and they had a really great series of potluck parties where they invited all kinds of artist friends and so on. And it was there
and science fiction writers and all sorts of interesting people in the LA area.
Yes, and it was there that I first became acquainted with the furry fandom, and people who identified as furries, people who were furry artists and carried sketchbooks of anthropomorphic art everywhere they went. And so I became familiar with them and their artwork, and I've never really considered myself to be a furry, although a lot of people these days actually call me Wolf, which is a name I've used for many years in one form or another. Mostly as an online name. It's becoming more and more of an offline name these days. But I've appreciated a lot of that, and I got to thinking that, hey, we need ideas for new games, and I don't think anybody has ever done a game where all the characters are anthropomorphic animals. And so I conceptualized and pitched an idea for kind of a high concept to my Dreamers Guild partners, and we all liked the idea enough that we all agreed that it was worth pursuing. So we did.
Did you work on the game's design?
Yeah, well, I mean, I conceptualized the high concept of the game, which was basically a post-human world where all the people left behind, unbeknownst to them, were actually genetic hybrids of humans and other species of animals that had tribalized and had their own unique cultures and had their own unique issues with each other and so on, but that in this world humans were the stuff of legend. So I conceptualized it very much as kind of a science fiction scenario because no one really knew what happened to the humans and no one even understood the science that humans used to create them. But humans obviously existed at some point because these very powerful artifacts still existed, and there was evidence of human existence. But I was also at that point a Christian in my life. I've moved away from religion since then, but because I was and still am very familiar with the Bible, I decided it would be very interesting to choose a biblical title for the game. And of course, the Bible speaks of the meek shall inherit the earth, so I abbreviated that to simply inherit the earth. The idea that being the morph have inherited the earth from these legendary godlike creatures, the humans. I also wrote the initial treatment of the basic game concept. The opening monologue of the game was my work, and that kind of set the tone for everything to follow. I also worked on a lot of the puzzles and sequences and things like that. But a lot of the main characters and the overall storyline, I worked with people and gave them feedback on, but it wasn't mine directly. I should add also that part of what motivated me to, or what gave me the idea for creating an adventure game around anthropomorphic animals was my previous work on other adventure games, but particularly the Jetsons that I did with Micro Illusions, which again I co-authored with my brother Michael. But we wrote the whole story together ourselves and plotted all the stories together ourselves, and it was a very different style of adventure game in many ways. But I always loved adventure games and D&D and so on, so that became a very natural next thing to do, or down the road a little bit. But it felt like a very natural idea to create a storytelling game around furries.
How would you rate the completed Inherit the Earth?
I'm still very proud of it. I think that some of the puzzles can get a little tedious at times, wandering through mazes and stuff like that. I wish we'd had more time and budget to make those a little bit richer. But it's something that, because you, Joe, have continued to publish it on various platforms, I'm still very proud to show it to friends and family and say, hey, I worked on this. And as far as I know, it was the very first adventure game that starred only anthropomorphic characters. And so in that sense, I think it made a little history. And I'm quite proud of it.
Any other comments about your time at the Dreamers Guild?
Well, it was an amazing experience. I think most of us had no idea how to run a company. We learned a lot in that period of time. We made some interesting mistakes, but I don't regret it at all. It was an amazing experience, and we created some really amazing products during that time. Worked for some pretty interesting clients, and we did things that I'm still very proud of, like Inherit the Earth. It's a time in my life that I'll always remember, and I'm very happy to have been had the role I did in creating it and doing what we did with it.
And if I remember correctly, it was kind of a family affair, and that both of your brothers eventually worked at the Dreamers Guild in some capacity.
Yeah, well, when I got into computers at a very young age, my whole family, including my mother and father, kind of followed me into it, and my brothers in particular. Michael, who's only a year and a half younger than me, he kind of took the academic route. Much younger brother, Stephen, who's I think 8 years younger, he started as a game tester at the Dreamers Guild when he was quite young, and he's been a game designer professionally for many years now. He's now worked on one of the Spider-Man games, and so he truly loves designing very, very in-depth, intense games, and he's worked for quite a few companies now.
What projects have you been involved with recently?
So what I've been working on recently, I've always been an Apple fanboy, and so after the Apple II, I worked on a number of other 8-bit platforms and 16-bit platforms like the Amiga, but I kept coming back to the Mac. And when Apple finally announced the iPhone, I realized that was my future, and I jumped on that. And I've been doing mostly iPhone mobile development since then. Probably the thing that stands out most on my resume is eHarmony, their app. They're the dating service. And they basically had no app, and they were kind of late to the game, and I was lucky enough to be the person they hired to do that. So I gave them their app. I've worked on several other commercial apps, mobile parking payments, and so on. I'm currently working as the chief Swift architect for a company called Vixlet. Swift is Apple's brand new programming language, and I'm very excited about that. So I'm currently, Vixlet basically has a social media platform, and they have clients like Major League Baseball and the Association of Tennis Professionals and the heavy metal band Slipknot. And so all their apps are basically the Vixlet app that's been rebranded for these various clients. And so I'm basically in charge of completely rewriting their existing app in Apple's new programming language and kind of rebuilding it from the ground up. And it's kind of really ready for a 2.0 revision. So that's the kind of thing I love to do, and that's what they hired me to do, so I'm very happy with that.
Well, thank you for spending some time with me today.
You're welcome. I've really enjoyed it.
The 2016 Electronics Entertainment Expo, aka E3, was held from June 14 to 16 at the LA Convention Center. But the first event I attended for E3 was the day before on June 13th. This was a get-together for members of the International Game Developers Association held at Button Mash, a bar and restaurant decked out in pinball machines and arcade video games. The establishment is probably not named after this cult. My day at the con proper started at the West Hall, which is where the booths of the 3 big console manufacturers were found. First off, we have the Microsoft booth, which was about 90% Xbox related. Their booth is dominated by stations to play games and doesn't use much space for other displays. There was one for the game Sea of Thieves, though. Next up is the Sony PlayStation booth. Here is a selection of peripherals including VR glasses. You can always distinguish PlayStation motion detection equipment from other companies through the big colored balls used for that purpose. Sony also had a theater area to view upcoming games, if you don't mind standing in long lines. The cycle and interest for rhythm games must be on the upswing. The Nintendo booth was mostly devoted to previewing the next Legend of Zelda game, Breath of the Wind. The company even set up a large area with life-size replicas of characters and scenes from the game, which you could explore if you were willing to wait in a long line. A rep from Nintendo was previewing part of the game live.
So, you're scary. Oh, gonna have to get the shop up at the top of that.
Come on then.
Never mind.
You eat most of my food too. Okay, this is gonna be a battle of wills then. Let it be.
Oh my god, got this.
Oh, this is not how I wanted this to go. For the record, we're gonna make it work. Yeah, that's what you get. I showed him who's boss. I really did.
That's one hall done. The long corridor between the main halls was bedecked with many LEGO Dimension-related banners. And then a faux New Orleans-style wake passed through. Here are some nifty props based on items from Fallout 4, including a Pip-Boy. Bethesda also had a walkthrough area based on the upcoming game Prey 3. This LEGO creation is so intricate, I'm just going to let my pictures do the talking. The Mafia 3 booth was styled on a New Orleans street scene. I would rate it one of the nicest booths in the South Hall. There were a lot of games being shown at the Square Enix booth. And I mean a lot of games. Bridge Crew is the newest Star Trek game. The Ubisoft ref was demoing the game inside an enclosed area of their booth. The Altus booth was demoing Persona 5. Here we see some of the characters from that game. Altus was also giving away hats for Instant Morgana cosplay. Objection! Airships are always a good transport for fighting monsters, right? Friendly cows. I wonder what game they're from. Oh, right. Not every booth was about game software. Hardware of many sorts was also on display. Maybe you wanted to rent a dome to get some proper stadium-style gameplay. Or an egg set up for creating instant 3D photos of people. Possibly a, wait a second, that looks familiar. Super Soul Brothers is not a game. It's a real band that sells actual music. And that's it for the South Hall. Many companies only have a presence at E3 for the purpose of holding meetings and giving private demos. Their booths, like the one for Telltale Games, are located in one of the convention center's smaller halls. But the Telltale Games booth is a bit more interesting than the usual. The South Hall lobby had many interesting sights. Here you could get a picture of yourself riding on a giant bird, or standing with some characters from a game. Events also were going on outside the convention center. Sony had a tent set up to allow con-goers to play their game MLB The Show, or take actual batting practice, or get a drink at a bar. LA Live, located across the street from the convention center, had its square set aside for the general public to participate in some E3-related activities. The game company Devolver Digital had taken over a parking lot to show off their game. And that's it for this month. Time to move on.